brain is wider than the sky. For put them side by side, the one the other will contain with ease, and you beside. The brain is deeper than the sea, for hold them blue to blue, the one the other will absorb as sponges buckets do. The brain is just the weight of God, for heft them pound for pound, and they will differ, if they do, as syllable from sound.
I must tell you about the character of Amherst. It is a lady whom the people call the Myth. She is a sister of Mr. Dickinson, and seems to be the climax of all the family oddity. She has not been outside her own house in 15 years, except once to see a new church, when she crept out at night and viewed it by moonlight. She writes finely, but no one ever sees her. Her sister, who was at Mr. Dickinson's party, invited me to come and sing to her mother sometime, and I promised to go. People tell me that the Myth will hear every note. She will be near, but unseen. It was odd to think, as my voice rang out through the big silent house, that Miss Emily, in her weird white dress, was outside in the shadow, hearing every word, and the mother, bedridden for years, was listening upstairs.
Brightly shining o'er me, with glances of love.
I sang better than ever. When I stopped, the rare and mysterious Emily sent me in a glass of rich sherry and a poem written as I sang.
Mabel Loomis Todd was the young wife of an Amherst College professor when she recorded, rather breathlessly, her first encounter with Emily Dickinson. She was using and embellishing what has since become the stuff of legend. The half-mad poetess scribbling masterpieces on the back of grocery lists, the spinster clad in the white gown of an eternal bride, the recluse nursing a broken heart, the good fairy who, like Peter Pan, refused to grow up and remained an aging child in her father's house. Like all legends that endure, this one has some fact to support it. We Americans are an open, rather public people, so it's not surprising that anyone so deeply personal as Emily Dickinson should be the object of our wonder and curiosity. But the truth is that the woman, the artist behind this evocative legend, is really much more interesting. It was not, after all, the legend that produced the poetry. It was the work of an exquisite intelligence, finely, often painfully attuned to what she called the soul's superior instance. In such moments of almost mystical vision, she was able to capture, in her words again, eternity's disclosure. In 1633, English Puritans from the Massachusetts Bay Colony sailed up the Connecticut, past Dutch forts, and opened the river's fertile northern valleys to settlers. Emily Dickinson's ancestors came with the first settlers to Hadley, at the foot of Mount Holyoke. Later generations moved north along the river to other hamlets, like Amherst, the farming community where Emily was born in 1830, where she lived and died in obscurity. Emily Dickinson and Amherst College grew up together, though of course she couldn't attend the all-male school. Her grandfather, lawyer Samuel Fowler Dickinson, was one of its most zealous founders. He also built another Amherst landmark, the Dickinson homestead, a symbol of family preeminence and Emily's birthplace. The squire's passion for Puritan education got the better of him, though. When funds ran out, he dipped into his own pocket. Before long, he was bankrupt and had to sell the homestead. He went west to mend his fortunes, but died in poverty in Ohio. His oldest son, Edward, stayed, opened his own law office, and set about restoring the family name. He and his wife, the shy, self-effacing Emily Norcross, settled into a house on Pleasant Street, not far from the homestead. This was their home for the next 15 years. There, the Dickinson children spent their childhood and adolescence. Austin, the firstborn, had his mother's coloring. Lavinia did too. Emily, 18 months younger than Austin and 3 years older than Lavinia, had the auburn hair and hazel eyes of her father. Health was a major worry. When his children were sick, Edward Dickinson dispensed the medicine himself. His concern was well-founded. The mortality rate was fearfully high. The Dickinsons' kitchen window, with writing table nearby, looked out over the cemetery. 12 of Emily's friends and relatives died in one winter alone, and she probably saw the funeral processions go by. Death's presence heightened her sense of being alive, and yet she wrote, "The bareheaded life underground worries one, like a wasp. The cemetery remains, just as she knew it, but the house on Pleasant Street is gone, replaced by a gas station." Emily spent a year at Mount Holyoke Seminary in 1847 to 48. It was the longest time she was ever away from home. Mount Holyoke was the creation and reflection of one woman, Mary Lyon. She founded it on the model of Amherst College, but with a difference. It was a female seminary, not a college. Her young ladies were to serve in a man's world as missionaries, teachers, and mothers. Mary Lyon, gently but persistently, aimed to make Christians of all her charges. Of the 235 in Emily's year, the majority did not come as believers. The non-believers were divided into those with hope and those with no hope. When brought to a point of interest, they were asked to stand and declare themselves for Christ. At one gathering, according to legend, all rose except one, Emily Dickinson. It isn't likely. There were 30 girls in Emily's year who remained no-hopers. Emily was not an atheist, nor was she an agnostic. The existence of God and an eternity called heaven were things she took for granted and explored in her poetry throughout her life. What she shunned were dogmas and creeds. And deep down, she was afraid that her emotions might betray her mind. Emily enjoyed the seminary. She liked to take long walks along its streams and across its fields. But she was homesick, too, which she characteristically disguised with humor. To her brother Austin, always her confidant, she wrote, "Has the Mexican War terminated? And how? Are we beat? Do you know of any nation about to besiege South Hadley?" About her studies, in which she always did well, she told him she was immersed in the history of sulfuric acid. In mid-year at Holyoke, about the time of her 17th birthday, Emily sat for a daguerreotype portrait. It is the only photograph of her that has survived. Her slender fingers, holding a cluster of arbutus, her narrow shoulders, her long, thin neck, and soft chin, all give the impression of delicacy. Her eyes tell quite a different story. They look back at the camera with challenging directness and reveal a rather willful intelligence. When Emily was almost 25, Edward Dickinson bought back the homestead on Main Street. In November 1855, the family returned. It was a great day for Edward. He had restored the Dickinsons to their former eminence. Emily had mixed feelings about coming back to the mansion, that old castle, she called it. She had been supremely happy at the house on Pleasant Street, and now she felt lost. I'm out with lanterns, looking for myself, she said. But here she stayed for the rest of her life, and she wrote nearly all her poetry here. I can't help but feel her presence in the house whenever I come here. In a world she always called my father's, here, she had a world of her own. She wrote at a table facing south and west, not with a view of funerals now, but the parade of village life, passing circus, the whistling neighbor, the Boston stagecoach, and an array of sunsets that she called the far theatricals of day. We don't know just when she started writing poetry. At 15, the year this silhouette was made, she wrote to a friend that young ladies aim to be poetical nowadays. Her first poems were satirical valentines to students in her father's law firm. Another law student, Benjamin Newton, introduced her to new writers. Her father scornfully dismissed them as modern. Remembering Newton years later, Emily said, "My dying tutor told me he would like to live till I had been a poet." Unhappily, Newton did not. He died of tuberculosis within 2 years. But his encouragement set her on the way. Among the books he gave her were the poems of Ralph Waldo Emerson. Emerson's essay, The Poet, seems almost addressed to Emily. Why covet a knowledge of new facts? Day and night, house and garden, a few books, a few actions serve us as well as would all trades and spectacles. We are far from having exhausted the significance of the few symbols we use. We can come to use them yet with a terrible simplicity. There's a certain slant of light, winter afternoons, that oppresses, like the heft of cathedral tunes. Heavenly hurt it gives us. We can find no scar, but internal difference, where the meanings are. None may teach it any. 'Tis the seal, despair, an imperial affliction sent us of the air. When it comes, the landscape listens, shadows hold their breath. When it goes, 'tis like the distance on the look of death. One need not be a chamber to be haunted. One need not be a house. The brain has corridors surpassing material place. That portraying was sent to her oldest friend, Sue Gilbert, who not only wrote poetry with Emily, but also criticized her poems. Sister Sue, as Emily called her, was a bright, well-read, witty, and extraordinary young woman. As girls, she and Emily joined the Shakespeare Club and read the uncensored versions of the plays. They also shared romantic novels like Reveries of a Bachelor and talked of love and marriage and literature on long walks. Like Benjamin Newton, Sue opened new worlds of literature for Emily. She gave her books by Charlotte and Emily Bronte, the Brownings, Keats, Coleridge, and Emily idolized her. And so she was delighted when Austen and Sue became engaged. Before they married, Austen and Sue talked of leaving and going west. But Edward Dickinson, who was almost tyrannical in his efforts to keep the family together, offered to build them a house and make Austen a partner in his law firm. Well, the loving blackmail worked, and they stayed in Amherst. And the house was built in 1856, and it was called the Evergreens. It was and is an imposing house in the Italian villa style, just 100 yards from the Dickinson homestead. With Sue right next door, Emily could send even more poems than before. One of these was Safe in Their Alabaster Chambers. Safe in their alabaster chambers, untouched by morning and untouched by noon, lie the meek members of the resurrection, rafter of satin and roof of stone. Grand go the years in the crescent above them. Worlds scoop their arcs, and firmaments row. Diadems drop, and doges surrender, soundless as dots on a disk of snow. Sometime in 1858, Emily met Samuel Bowles, editor of the Springfield Republican, a frequent visitor to the Evergreens. For Emily, Bowles was doubly attractive. He was a magnetic man with a roguish sense of humor, and he had a habit of printing women's poetry in his paper. Over the next few years, Bowles published 5 of Emily's poems, some of them slightly edited, and all anonymously. He printed nothing more. Even worse, he didn't return her ardent affection, but they did remain lifelong friends. To my small hearth his fire came, and all my house aglow did fan and rock with sudden light. 'Twas sunrise. 'Twas the sky, impaneled from no summer brief, with limit of decay. 'Twas noon, without the news of night. Nay, nature, it was day. Years later, after Bowles' death, Emily said his biography seemed a memoir of the sun when the noon is gone. At 30, Emily was a mature poet. She began to sew her best poems together in booklets, using ordinary household thread, maybe to prepare her work to send to publishers. These were also years of mental crisis. At times, she thought she was losing her mind. She wrote to a friend, "I had a terrace in September. I could tell to none. And so I sing, as the boy does by the burying ground, because I am afraid." 3 extraordinary love letters addressed to an unknown man she called Master survived from this period of anguish. And the last one is a cry of despair. "I am older tonight, Master, but the love is the same. And so are the moon and the crescent. If it had been God's will that I might breathe where you breathed and find the place myself at night, if I can forget that I am not with you and that sorrow and frost are nearer than I. If I wish with a might I cannot repress, that mine were the queen's place, the love of the Plantagenet is my only apology. About this time, Emily wrote her longest poem, I Cannot Live With You. It shows a new realism, even a resignation to a life without master. It begins, I cannot live with you. It would be life. And life is over there, behind the shelf. The sexton keeps the key to, putting up our life, his porcelain, like a cup. But Emily hadn't given up hope of publication. 6 days after Samuel Bowles sailed for a European holiday, she sent some of her poems to an editor of the Atlantic Monthly, Thomas Wentworth Higginson, literary critic, anti-slavery activist, and champion of women's rights. Higginson was intrigued, but confused by the poetry. He wrote back saying he thought her work spasmodic, uncontrolled, wayward, in short, unconventional. And yet at times, he found it fiery with insight. Emily accepted his meager crumbs of encouragement and continued writing more than ever. My business, she told Higginson, is circumference. By circumference, she meant that her poetry was a way of continually enlarging both her material world and the world of her mind. As she said to Higginson, if I read a book and it makes my whole body so cold, no fire can ever warm me, I know that is poetry. If I feel physically as if the top of my head were taken off, I know that is poetry. These are the only ways I know it. Is there any other way? After great pain, a formal feeling comes. The nerve sits ceremonious, like tombs. The stiff heart questions, was it he that bore, and yesterday, or centuries before? The feet, mechanical, go round of ground or air or aught, a wooden way, regardless grown, a quartz contentment like a stone. This is the hour of lead, remembered if outlived, as freezing persons recollect the snow, first chill, then stupor, then the letting go. Sometime in these years, Emily Dickinson began wearing white, and white only. This dress is one she wore in her 50s. Dressing only in white was an act of dramatic individuality. White had special meanings to her. Dare you see a soul at the white heat? She asked in a poem. In another, she said the dead, dressed in frocks of purest snow. In still another, to Samuel Bowles, she portrayed herself as a female Christ figure, Empress of Calvary. And in return, he teasingly called her my queen recluse. She was, in fact, gradually withdrawing from the world. Once, when Bowles came to call, and she refused to see him, he ran halfway up the stairs and shouted, I've come all the way from Springfield to see you. Now come down here, you damned rascal. Well, she didn't come down, but signed her next note to him, your rascal. P.S. I washed the adjective. At the age of 38, she said, I do not cross my father's grounds to any house or town. Her physical world may have been narrowed, but she still read her daily newspaper, and she kept up a huge correspondence with her friends. Her books were still Shakespeare and the Bible, but also George Eliot and Henry James. Another way of keeping in touch was playing with her niece and nephews and their friends. She would lower her frosted, homemade gingerbread down to them like manna from heaven. Emily went on writing, though not at the pace of the early 1860s. Sometimes she revised old poems. This was her form of play, while others of her social class in Amherst turned to new diversions. Because I could not stop for death, he kindly stopped for me. The carriage held but just ourselves and immortality. We slowly drove, he knew no haste, and I had put away my labor and my leisure too for his civility. We passed the school where children strove at recess in the ring. We passed the fields of gazing grain. We passed the setting sun, or rather, he passed us. The dews drew quivering and chill, for only gossamer my gown, my tippet only tulle. We paused before a house that seemed a swelling of the ground. The roof was scarcely visible, the cornice in the ground. Since then, 'tis centuries, and yet feel shorter than the day I first surmised the horses' heads were toward eternity. In the spring of 1886, after 3 years of illness, Emily died. She was 55. Afterwards, her sister Lavinia discovered to her great surprise nearly 1,800 manuscript poems in Emily's bureau drawer. She and the people of Amherst soon realized that a major poet had lived and died among them without their knowing it. Emily called her poems my letter to the world that never wrote to me. At their best, they are delicately crafted transcriptions of what she felt were bulletins from immortality. The poets light but lamps, themselves go out. The wicks they stimulate, if vital light, inhere as do the suns, each age a lens disseminating their circumference.